This episode was recorded during the virtual meeting of the Executive Committee of the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network on Climate Change and Sustainability, titled Parliamentary Exchange, Strategies for Bold Climate Initiatives, organized by ParlAmericas. In this presentation, Sapphire Alexander, founder of Caribbean Feminist, discusses the importance of collaborative and inclusive climate action. She highlights how climate change acts as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing inequalities and posing risks to work environments. To address the challenges posed by climate change, Sapphire emphasizes the value of partnerships between parliaments and civil society organizations, underscores the need to support women and girls' leadership and protect environmental defenders, and ensure that traditionally marginalized communities have a voice in decision-making processes.
Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here in the space with you this morning, especially on the eve of the International Women's Day, which is tomorrow. I've long been an admirer of the work that ParlAmericas has been doing throughout the region to promote gender equality, strengthen diplomacy, and facilitate collaboration with civil society. I also have to mention that I'm a direct beneficiary of one of the programs that ParlAmericas has done, the Young Women in Leadership program. So it feels a bit surreal to come back to this community in this specific capacity and to be able to talk about something that I'm so passionate about, which is climate justice. My other colleagues previously would have talked about, how dire the circumstances around the climate crisis are for us here in the Caribbean. In the last decade, we know global sea levels have risen by 8 inches. We have continuously broken global annual warming records, and carbon emissions have reached an all-time high. It's estimated that by 2050, we'll reach the point of total environmental collapse, exceeding the 1.5 degree warming limit, which we talked about. We've already exceeded in 2024, and sending our ecosystems into a tailspin. And again, these are all statistics that we who work in the environmental space every day are grappling with on a daily basis. However, the thing about the climate crisis, and this is something that we really hone in on as civil society, is that it's a threat multiplier, meaning that it takes these existing inequalities across the intersections of race, gender, and class and makes them that much worse. Yes, the climate crisis will impact us all, but for women and girls, LGBTQ plus folks, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous communities, the impact of this crisis will be far worse. I've put some key figures on here to showcase just how some of these communities have been impacted. I spoke about Indigenous communities, the lack of representation of women in climate decision-making, and the LGBTQ plus community, just to share for y'all. Intersectional issues like the climate crisis require intersectional solutions. And unfortunately, our governments are not where they need to be to address these intersections in our climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. And so then what happens? Civil society comes in to fill these policy and implementation gaps, despite limited and shrinking resources and threats to personal safety, to provide support to marginalized communities, to facilitate community resilience training programs, to conduct research, produce reports, and advocate for better policy in multilateral spaces. For example, in 2023, my team and I recognized a lack of policy provisions to protect workers from adverse climate impacts, as outlined in Trinidad and Tobago's Occupational Health and Safety Act. So in 2023, we launched the Redefining Work series, which is an environmental and labor justice initiative, where we publish articles, facilitate community trainings on identifying and mitigating climate risks at work, and conduct research with the aim of developing policy recommendations. I put our impact report here for anybody who would like to take a look at it. But in our research, just to brief you, is we have found that 88% of respondents have not been provided with training on how to adapt to or mitigate the effects of the climate crisis at their jobs, yet over 70% of our respondents share that they frequently work in adverse weather conditions. Some of them, that being 30%, shared that they are directly impacted by the climate crisis at work daily, yet we do not have policy provisions to support these communities. Yet another gap that existed was identified by Girls Care Jamaica, which is another incredible CSO, that identified the lack of representation of women in climate decision-making, which is especially jarring when we look at the fact that 4 out of 5 women will be directly impacted by the climate crisis. and that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. However, despite these statistics, less than 30% of climate negotiators globally are women. 5 years ago, Girls Care Jamaica developed a climate mentorship program to train a new generation of female climate leaders throughout the region. They do this program every year, and I would really encourage you to take a look at some of the incredible young leaders that have come out of this. Within our current political context, when there's a direct attack on DEI, there's a repression of civic space, and there's rampant gender backlash, parliamentarians play a really, really, really crucial role as partners with civil society so that we can continue to do this work and to support our communities. As civil society organizations, we have 4 main priorities that I'm going to take you through today. And those are enhanced participation of civil society in key decision-making spaces. And that's something that the prior speaker spoke about as well. Bold intersectional approaches to climate policy reform, and resource mobilization. And resource mobilization, again, is something that my colleague before also touched on. So I'm glad that we have aligned. So to tackle enhanced participation first, despite the intangible contributions of civil society to climate justice, we remain noticeably absent from key decision-making spaces. The statistics of CSO representation are pretty small. Additionally, when we are in these multilateral spaces, we're often relegated to the sidelines. We're not able to directly intervene or provide suggestions to outcome documents. This is something that we've seen at huge climate conferences like COP 27, 28, 29. And it was also something that we observed as civil society at the recent CIDS4 last year in Antigua and Barbuda. This is especially frightening within our current socio-political context, as I would have mentioned, where civic space is shrinking, where climate science is being denied, and oil lobbyists continue to advance their harmful agenda right here in one of the most climate vulnerable regions. We need civil society and our voices to push back in the negotiating rooms and to ensure that the policies that are coming out from these multilateral spaces are serving our communities adequately. How do we fight back? Meaningful civil society representation looks like continuous, strong consultations with civil society to determine and measure national priorities as it pertains to climate justice. It can look like facilitating CSO advisory groups with Parliament, or there's a really brilliant case example that was implemented in Belize where there's a permanent national CSO network representative sitting on the Senate, directly interacting with policy and ensuring that CSO priorities align alongside government priorities to maximize impact. The second priority that I want to look at is that of intersectional approaches. And I talked about this quite a bit at the beginning, that importance of an intersectional approach to climate justice. And this means ensuring that diverse communities are integrated at all stages of climate policy development. This is from the brainstorming phase to design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. This involves conducting climate analysis at the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and includes measures such as, for example, integrating the minimal initial service package, which is something that was outlined by the UNFPA in disaster response and relief. That's a sexual and reproductive health framework in the aftermath of natural disasters, and utilizing gender disaggregated data in all climate research to inform policy. These frameworks and these tools exist, and they're available to us, but we need to make sure that we're bridging that gap between having those frameworks and then also having them inform the policies that are developed. We need to ensure that the needs of all our constituents are being adequately considered and that no one at all is being left behind. The third point that I want to touch on is that of policy reform. Most notably, civil society actors, especially here in the Caribbean, have been really calling for the ratification of the Escazú Agreement. That's a really huge deal for us right now. And this landmark instrument, as most of you would be familiar with, covers the freedom of access to environmental data, the protection of environmental defenders, and it also allows environmental defenders to seek justice within climate litigation. I'm speaking directly to my own country's government here, as well as that of Jamaica, Costa Rica, Barbados, in calling for the ratification of this document. Further to this, for countries who have ratified Escazú, we must ensure that the conditions outlined in this agreement are upheld and that environmental data is accessible and freely available to the public, and that environmental defenders can safely serve their communities and seek justice where necessary. Again, we're facing such a huge global pushback within the climate environment, so we must ensure that instruments like the Escazú Agreement are strong, are fortified, so that this integral work can continue. The final key priority that I'm going to discuss today is that of resource mobilization. And my colleague spoke about this so eloquently before on the importance of resourcing, financing, to ensure that our NDCs can be implemented. But I also want to talk about the fact that civil society organizations do need resources as well to be able to continue to do this work. And that can be in the form of directly resourcing CSOs, but it also can be in the form of directing CSOs towards existing resources that you know about and have access to, whether that be funds, partners, etc., but we don't know about. So I think that there is, again, such value in partnership between CSOs and parliamentarians so that we can ensure that this work is allowed to continue. Before I close, I really wanted to share this resource with you. Hopefully it'll come up in a second. Okay, amazing. This resource with you, and it's one that I referenced quite a bit in my remarks this morning, and it's a document called The Future SIDS Want, and it was developed as a reaction to the Antigua-Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, which, as we would know, is the outcome document from SIDS 4, which would have happened again last year in Antigua and Barbuda. And so before the conference, civil society organizations convened by Canary Caribbean put together this document as a reaction to what we believe to be some gaps in ABAS. However, it remains applicable and pertinent to all climate justice and sustainable development work. And the recommendations here are quite strong, and they provide, in a little bit more depth than I can get into in 10 minutes, how civil society and governments and parliamentarians can work together to ensure the sustainable and just development of our regions. As I continue, I would encourage you all to take a look at it. And just to close, I really like to emphasize that, we as members of civil society and as parliamentarians, we really have a shared passion for the well-being of our respective and collective communities and nations that we are so very fortunate to serve. And there's power in that collaboration. So let not the opportunities to make positive and needed change go to waste. Civil society, we are ready and willing to work with Parliament. We no longer have the luxury of time, of ego, or prejudice. We need to collaborate. Are you ready to take up that call? Thanks so much.